Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story is of John Beebe, a seeker of shadows who dared to map the hidden continents of the mind. Relax as we explore the life and work of John Beebe, a gentle psychiatrist and cartographer of the soul, who explore the mind, discovering that our personality itself is a living myth, and that within each psychological function dwells an archetype waiting to guide us through the labyrinth of consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychology and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the landscape of the soul. Tell me in the comments what draws you most: the mystery of dreams, the spark of emotion, the intangibility of spirit, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the life and work of John Beebe as we wander the corridors of the unconscious and listen to the whispering mind beneath the mind. There are moments in the history of thought when a single individual takes a map already drawn and adds to it dimensions no one had imagined before. Not by destroying what came before, but by deepening it, by turning flat landscapes into mountain ranges with hidden valleys where new meanings dwell. John Beebe is one such figure. His contribution to psychology did not come with fanfare or revolution, but with a quiet persistence of someone who knew that beneath the surface of our familiar ways of thinking about personality, there lived something older, something archetypal, something that whispered of gods and heroes and shadows dancing in the firelight of consciousness. John Beebe was born in 1939, in the waning years before the world would erupt into its second great conflagration. He came into a world suspended between epochs, a world where the old certainties were crumbling and new ways of understanding the human psyche were emerging from the work of men like Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung. America in 1939 was a nation still recovering from economic devastation, a country where families gathered around radios and listened to distant voices speaking of matters both mundane and momentous. It was a time when psychology was still relatively young, still finding its voice, still discovering the vast territories of the unconscious mind. The details of Beebe's childhood are not widely chronicled in the way that some public figures document every moment of their early years. He was not born into celebrity, nor did he emerge from dramatic circumstances that would mark him as exceptional from birth. Instead, his was the kind of childhood that belongs to many thoughtful people who would later become explorers of the mind, quiet, observant, perhaps marked by an unusual sensitivity to the emotional currents around him. In interviews and in the warm, conversational tone of his later writings and lectures, one can sense a man who watched the world carefully, who noticed the patterns in how people related to each other, who felt the presence of something more beneath the surface interactions of daily life. Growing up in mid-century America meant growing up in a culture undergoing rapid transformation. The war years would have shaped his early consciousness, even if only through the anxieties and preoccupations of the adults around him. Post-war America, where Beebe came of age, was a place of both optimism and conformity, where the rising middle class pursued the dream of stability and normalcy, while beneath that surface, existential questions bubbled up through the works of writers and thinkers who sensed that something was missing from the material prosperity and social conventions of the time. Education was Beebe's pathway, as it is for many who feel the call to understand the human condition more deeply. He pursued his studies with a kind of dedication that suggests not merely academic ambition, but a genuine hunger to comprehend the mysteries of consciousness and behavior. His path led him to medicine, to psychiatry, to the clinical encounter between doctor and patient, where theory meets the living reality of human suffering and human striving. But Beebe's temperament was never that of the purely clinical practitioner. There was in him, from the beginning, something of the humanist, something of the philosopher, who sees in each individual case not merely symptoms to be treated, but stories to be understood, patterns to be recognized, meanings to be uncovered. It was perhaps inevitable that such a temperament would eventually find its way to the work of Carl Jung. Jung's psychology, with its emphasis on symbols, archetypes, and the collective unconscious, offered a vision of the psyche that was richer and more mysterious than the reductive models that dominated much of mid-century psychiatry. Where mainstream medicine often sought to eliminate symptoms and return patients to a baseline of normal functioning, Jungian psychology invited both analyst and analysand into a deeper journey, a process of individuation that meant not just recovery, but transformation, not just health, but wholeness. Beebe immersed himself in Jungian thought with the passion of someone who has found his true calling. He undertook training as a Jungian analyst, entering into that rigorous process of study and personal analysis that is required of those who would practice this particular form of depth psychology. The training of a Jungian analyst is not merely an academic exercise. It requires that the trainee undergo their own analysis, that they confront their own complexes and shadows, that they descend into their own unconscious before they can hope to guide others through that territory. This process marked Beebe profoundly, as it marks all who undertake it seriously. It was a crucible in which intellectual understanding was forged together with personal experience, creating the kind of knowledge that lives in the bones and not just in the mind. What drew Beebe particularly was Jung's theory of psychological types. Jung had proposed, in his landmark work, Psychological Types, published in 1921, that people could be understood according to certain fundamental orientations of consciousness. There were two basic attitudes, introversion and extroversion, and four functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Each person, Jung proposed, had a dominant function and attitude, a secondary or auxiliary function, and other functions that remained less developed, even inferior or repressed. This was the foundation upon which Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother, Catherine Cook Briggs, would later build the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, a tool that would become wildly popular in business, education, and popular psychology. But Beebe sensed something was missing from how typology was being understood and applied. The Myers-Briggs approach, for all its usefulness in helping people identify their preferences, had stripped away much of the depth and complexity of Jung's original vision. It had become, in many applications, a mere sorting mechanism, a way to label people as INTJs or ESFPs, as if these four letters could capture the totality of a human personality. The archetypal dimension, so central to Jung's entire psychology, had been largely lost. The shadow, that crucial counterpart to consciousness that Jung had written about so extensively, was barely acknowledged in popular typology. It was this gap that Beebe set out to bridge, not through criticism or rejection of what had come before, but through expansion, through deepening, through adding back the dimensions that had been lost. His project would occupy decades of his life, and would ultimately transform how Jungian analysts and serious students of typology understood the architecture of the psyche. The development of Beebe's model did not happen in isolation. He was part of a vibrant community of Jungian analysts, particularly centered in San Francisco, where he practiced for many years. This community, like Jungian communities around the world, was a place of intense intellectual ferment, where ideas were debated, refined, and tested against clinical experience. Analysts would present cases, discuss dreams, explore the theoretical implications of their work with patients. It was in this context of ongoing dialogue and reflection that Beebe's ideas took shape. One can imagine the conversations, late into the evening perhaps, where Beebe would have shared his emerging insights with colleagues. The setting might have been a comfortable study, bookshelves lined with volumes of John's collected works, perhaps a fire crackling softly, tea growing cold as the discussion deepened. Beebe might have begun by posing a question. If we accept Jung's model of the 8 function attitudes, extroverted thinking, introverted thinking, extroverted feeling, introverted feeling, and so on, through sensation and intuition, what is the relationship between these functions within the psyche? Are they simply arranged hierarchically, from most developed to least? Or is there a more complex architecture at work? His colleagues would have listened, perhaps some nodding in recognition, others puzzled or skeptical. Beebe would have continued, drawing on his clinical experience. He had noticed, in working with patients, that the inferior function, that function most repressed and undeveloped, did not simply lie dormant. It erupted, at times, with a kind of autonomous energy. It caught people by surprise. It acted, in Jung's language, like a complex, a semi-autonomous part of the psyche with its own intentions and energy. And if the inferior function acted like a complex, then perhaps it had an archetypal quality. Perhaps it was personified in the psyche, carrying with it certain characteristic ways of manifesting. This was the seed from which Beebe's 8-function model would grow. Over time, through clinical observation, through reflection on Jung's writings, through dialogue with colleagues and patients, he developed a comprehensive map that assigned to each of the 8 function attitudes a specific archetypal role within the personality structure. This was not arbitrary. Each assignment was grounded in careful observation of how these functions actually operated in people's lives, how they were experienced subjectively, how they influenced behavior and perception. The dominant or leading function, Beebe proposed, carries the energy of the hero or heroine archetype. This is the part of ourselves we lead with, the function we trust most, the one through which we engage the world with confidence. For an extroverted thinker, this heroic energy is carried by extroverted thinking, the ability to organize the external world according to logical principles, to make decisions, to take charge. For an introverted feeler, the hero function is introverted feeling, that deep, valuing function that knows with certainty what is important, what aligns with one's core values. The auxiliary or supporting function, the second strongest in the personality, Beebe, associated with the good parent or supportive parent archetype. This function assists the hero function, providing balance and support. It is reliable, helpful, nurturing in its domain. If our hero function is how we face the world courageously, our parent function is how we take care of ourselves and others, how we provide support and stability. The third function, often called the tertiary function in traditional typology. Beebe identified with the poor or puella, the eternal child archetype. This function is less developed than the first two, but it carries a quality of playfulness, creativity, and sometimes mischief. It is the part of ourselves that remains youthful, that brings spontaneity and possibility, but that can also be naive or unpredictable. And then comes the inferior function, that problematic and fascinating fourth function that Jung had already identified as particularly important. Beebe called this the anima or animus function, drawing on Jung's concept of the contrasexual soul image. This function connects us to the unconscious, to dimensions of experience that are foreign to our conscious ego identity. It is where we are vulnerable, where we lose our usual competence, but also where we may encounter something deeply meaningful, something numinous. But Beebe did not stop at 4 functions. Jung had recognized 8 function attitudes in total, each function thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, appearing in both introverted and extroverted forms. If someone's dominant function was, say, extroverted intuition, then their inferior function would be introverted sensation opposite in both. Function type and attitude. But what about the other 4 function attitudes, those that corresponded to the ego functions but in the opposite attitude? This is where Beebe's model becomes particularly innovative. He recognized that these other 4 function attitudes form what might be called the shadow personality, a kind of mirror image structure to the conscious ego. Just as the ego has a hero, parent, child, and animus function, so too does the shadow have its own structure, its own hierarchy of functions. The 5th function in Beebe's model, opposite to the hero function in attitude, but sharing its functional quality, he named the opposing personality or nemesis. This function opposes the hero, challenges it, appears when we feel defensive or attacked. It carries a quality of stubbornness, of digging in one's heels. If your hero function is extroverted thinking, your opposing personality would be introverted thinking, and it might show up when someone questions your logic, leading you to become rigidly dogmatic in defense of your position. The 6th function, opposite to the parent function, Beebe called the critical parent, or witch senex archetype. This is the voice of harsh judgment, of criticism, of should and ought to. It can be directed at ourselves or projected onto others. It carries the energy of the negative parent, the one who finds fault and shames. The 7th function, opposite to the child function, Beebe associated with the trickster archetype. This is the part of the psyche that creates double binds, that undermines us in foolish ways, that leads us into embarrassing mistakes. It has a kind of perverse creativity, a way of sabotaging us in areas where we are already vulnerable. Yet, as with all trickster figures in mythology, this function can also bring about necessary change through its disruptions. And finally, the 8th function, opposite in every way to the dominant function, opposite in both function type and attitude, Beebe called the demonic or destructive function. This is the most deeply repressed function, the one that operates most autonomously, most disconnected from ego consciousness. When it emerges, it can be catastrophic, leading to breakdowns, destructive behaviors, or overwhelming experiences. Yet this function, too, has its purpose in the larger economy of the psyche. This, then, was Beebe's great contribution a complete model of the 8 function attitudes organized according to archetypal roles. It was a model that restored depth and complexity to psychological type theory. It acknowledged that personality is not a simple matter of preferences, but a living drama played out among various characters or subpersonalities, each with its own archetypal energy, each with its own role to play in the unfolding story of a life. As Beebe developed this model, he also developed a method for communicating it, for making it accessible and alive to his students and audiences. He was deeply interested in film, in the way that movies present us with characters who embody different psychological functions and archetypal energies. He began using film analysis as a teaching tool, screening movies for his students, and then discussing the characters in terms of psychological type and archetypal dynamics. Imagine a workshop led by Beebe. The room is comfortable, perhaps with chairs arranged in a circle or semicircle. The lights dim, and a film begins to play. Perhaps it is a classic something like The Wizard of Oz or Star Wars, films with clear archetypal structures. Or perhaps something more subtle, a character-driven drama where the psychological dynamics are more nuanced. Beebe watches along with his students, but with a particular kind of attention, the attention of someone trained to see beneath the surface narrative to the archetypal patterns at work. When the film ends and the lights come up, Beebe might begin gently, inviting observations. What do you notice about Dorothy's journey? What was her dominant function, that way of engaging with the world that she led with, that carried her through her adventure? Perhaps extroverted feeling, some might suggest. That immediate, expressed emotional responsiveness to others. That ability to form connections quickly with her odd companions on the yellow brick road. And if Dorothy's hero function was extroverted feeling, what would that make her inferior function? The opposite in every way introverted thinking. And indeed, when does Dorothy get into trouble? When she tries to figure things out logically on her own, when she withdraws into her thoughts rather than expressing herself emotionally and connecting with others. The wizard himself might represent that inferior introverted thinking, an impressive facade of logical authority that turns out to be beneath the surface, vulnerable and uncertain. Beebe would guide the discussion, showing how each character in the film might represent different aspects of Dorothy's psyche, or how each character exemplified a different psychological type in action. The scarecrow seeking a brain, the tin man seeking a heart, the lion seeking courage. Each could be understood as representing an underdeveloped function seeking integration. The journey to Oz becomes a journey of individuation, a quest for wholeness that requires acknowledging and integrating the split-off parts of the self. This use of film as teaching tool was not mere entertainment or illustration. It was a way of making typology live in the imagination, of showing that these abstract concepts of functions and archetypes actually correspond to how we experience ourselves and others in the world. Film, like dream, presents us with images and stories that bypass our rational defenses and speak directly to the unconscious. By analyzing film through the lens of typology and archetypal psychology, Beebe helped his students develop what might be called psychological vision, the ability to see the deeper patterns at work in human behavior and relationships. Beebe's career unfolded over many decades, primarily in private practice, as a Jungian analyst in San Francisco, but also through teaching, writing, and presenting at conferences. He became a regular presence at gatherings of the Jungian community, presenting papers at the meetings of the International Association for Analytical Psychology and at the various Jungian institutes around the world. His manner was never that of the grandiose theorist proclaiming a new system. Rather, he was conversational, thoughtful, always willing to engage with questions and objections, always refining his ideas in response to new observations and insights. In his writing, Beebe demonstrated a particular gift for clarity and accessibility. He could write about complex theoretical matters in a way that remained grounded in clinical experience and everyday observation. His major book, Integrity in Depth, published in 1992, explored the ethical dimensions of psychological type, arguing that integrity requires not just adherence to moral principles, but a deep alignment between consciousness and the unconscious, between ego and self. Each type, he argued, has its own characteristic way of maintaining or losing integrity, its own particular temptations toward shadow behavior, its own path toward wholeness. Later works, including Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type, refined his 8-function model and explored its implications for understanding psychological development, relationship dynamics, and the process of individuation. He wrote about spine functions versus arm functions. Spine functions being those in the ego structure, the first 4 functions that form the backbone of the personality, while the shadow functions, the last 4, are more like arms that can reach into domains the ego cannot directly access. But perhaps Beebe's most important contribution, the one that has had the most lasting impact on the Jungian community and on serious students of typology, was his systematic working out of the shadow functions and their archetypal roles. Before Beebe, there was much discussion of the inferior function in Jungian circles, but the other shadow functions remained largely unexplored territory. By naming them, by identifying their archetypal characters, by showing how they operated in the psyche and in relationships, Beebe gave analysts and individuals a much more complete map for understanding the totality of the personality. This map proved especially valuable in understanding interpersonal conflict and projection. One of Beebe's key insights was that we often project our shadow functions onto others, especially those we find irritating or threatening. If I encounter someone who seems to embody my critical parent function, if they voice exactly the harsh, judgmental thoughts that my inner critic whispers, I may react with unusual intensity, not because of what they are actually saying, but because they have touched on something in my own shadow that I have not integrated. Similarly, Beebe showed how romantic attraction often involves projection of the anima or animus function. We fall in love with someone who seems to embody that inferior function, who lives easily in that domain where we ourselves are most vulnerable and least developed. An introverted thinking type might be irresistibly drawn to someone who expresses extroverted feeling fluently, who moves through social situations with emotional ease and grace. In the beloved, we see our own unlived possibilities, our own potential for wholeness. The challenge, of course, is to eventually recognize this as projection, to begin developing that function within ourselves rather than remaining dependent on the other to carry it for us. As Beebe grew older and his work became more widely known, he took on something of the role of elder statesman in the Jungian community. Younger analysts sought him out for supervision and consultation. He was generous with his time and knowledge, always interested in hearing about new clinical observations that might illuminate or challenge his theoretical model. He maintained a stance of what might be called humble authority, confident in his insights, but always open to revision, always aware that any model of the psyche is at best a useful approximation, never the full reality of the living human being. There is a quality to Beebe's life story that mirrors the very principles he taught. His journey was one of integration, of bringing together different aspects of psychology that had been split apart. He integrated Jung's typology with Jung's concept of the shadow. He integrated popular personality psychology with depth psychology and archetypal theory. He integrated theory with practice, clinical observation with philosophical reflection, and perhaps most importantly, he maintained an integration in his own person between the scientist and the humanist, between the analyst and the artist, between the systematizer and the storyteller. In his later years, Beebe continued to write and teach, though perhaps at a somewhat gentler pace. He enjoyed the company of colleagues and students, engaged in ongoing discussions about psychology and culture, and continued his clinical work with the dedication of someone who had found his true vocation. His legacy was already secure. His model of the 8 function attitudes had become standard teaching in many Jungian training programs. His books were widely read, and his influence could be seen in the way that younger analysts approached questions of typology and the shadow. But legacy, in the end, is not about recognition or influence in the worldly sense. The true legacy of someone like Beebe is in the transformation of consciousness that their work makes possible in the individuals who come to understand themselves more deeply through the maps they have drawn, in the relationships that are healed when projection is recognized and withdrawn, in the moments of integration when a person embraces a shadow function and experiences a new kind of wholeness. John Beebe lived and worked with the knowledge that the psyche is not a machine to be repaired or a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived, a story to be told, a journey to be undertaken. His contribution was to give us better maps for that journey, maps that honor both the structure and the depth of human consciousness, maps that show us that in our very personalities, in the way we think and feel and sense and intuit, there dwell gods and heroes and shadows and tricksters, all waiting to be known, all calling us toward the great work of becoming whole. Now let us turn from the story of Beebe's life to the substance of his work, to the intricate architecture of the 8-function model and the vision of the psyche it reveals. Let us explore, slowly and carefully, what it means to say that personality itself is a myth being lived, that within each psychological function dwells an archetypal energy, and that the path to wholeness requires engaging with both the light of consciousness and the darkness of the shadow. At the heart of Beebe's contribution is a fundamental reimagining of what psychological type means. In the popular understanding that has dominated through the Myers-Briggs type indicator and its many variants, type is essentially a matter of preference. Do you prefer extroversion or introversion? Thinking or feeling? Intuition or sensation? Judging or perceiving? Answer these questions and you receive a 4-letter code that describes your type. This approach has its value. It can help people understand that not everyone thinks or processes information the same way they do, that what comes naturally to one person may be difficult for another. That diversity of cognitive style is real and important. But this approach, useful as it is, leaves out the depth dimension. It treats the psyche as if it were a collection of preferences, static and fixed. It does not account for the dynamic interplay of functions, for the way that different functions are activated in different situations, for the way that the repressed functions exert their influence from the unconscious, for the process of development and integration that Jung called individuation. Beebe's model restores this depth by reframing psychological type in archetypal terms. An archetype, in Jungian psychology, is not just a pattern or a character type. It is a living reality in the psyche, a form of psychic energy that has its own intentionality, its own way of being in the world. When Jung wrote about archetypes like the mother, the hero, the wise old man, or the shadow, he was describing fundamental structures of human experience that appear across cultures and throughout history, that shape how we perceive and relate to the world, that show up in our dreams and fantasies, that move us toward certain behaviors and away from others. By saying that each psychological function is associated with an archetype, Beebe was making a radical claim that the way we think and feel and perceive is not just a matter of cognitive mechanics, but is imbued with meaning, with purpose, with a kind of personification. The hero function is not just the function we use most skillfully. It is the part of us that goes forth to meet the world with courage, that takes on challenges, that defines our identity. The parent function is not just a supporting function. It carries the energy of care, of responsibility, of nurturance or structure. The child function is not just less developed. It retains the spontaneity and creativity and vulnerability of childhood. Let us consider each of these archetypal functions in turn, dwelling on what they mean and how they manifest in lived experience. We begin, naturally, with the hero. The hero function, the dominant or leading function in Beebe's model, is the function through which we most confidently engage with the world. It is our go-to mode of consciousness, the function that feels most natural, most reliable, most us. When we are operating in our hero function, we feel competent and capable. We trust our perceptions and judgments. We feel, in some essential way, that we are being ourselves. Each type has a different hero function, and this shapes fundamentally how that type experiences reality. An extroverted thinking type, whose hero function is extroverted thinking, approaches the world primarily through the lens of logical organization of external reality. They see systems, structures, hierarchies. They naturally notice what works and what doesn't work, what is efficient and what is wasteful. They are drawn to create order in the external world, to make decisions, to implement plans. When they enter a room, they might immediately notice how the space is organized, whether the meeting has a clear agenda, how the team structure is functioning. This is not calculated or artificial. It is simply how their consciousness naturally operates. Contrast this with an introverted feeling type, whose hero function is introverted feeling. This type approaches the world primarily through the lens of inner values and emotional authenticity. They have a deep sense of what is important, what is right, what aligns with their core values. They are exquisitely sensitive to questions of authenticity, both in themselves and others. They might enter the same room and immediately sense the emotional atmosphere. Notice who seems genuine and who seems to be wearing a mask. I feel drawn toward or repelled by different individuals based on a deep intuitive sense of values alignment. They are guided by an internal compass of feeling that may be difficult to articulate, but is deeply reliable. The hero function is where we shine. It is our gift to the world. But the hero, as all myths teach us, also has limitations. The hero's strength is also their weakness, because they may rely too heavily on this one function, neglecting other ways of engaging with reality. The extroverted thinking type may become so focused on logical efficiency that they neglect the human dimension, the values and feelings that cannot be captured in a spreadsheet or org chart. The introverted feeling type may become so absorbed in questions of authenticity and values alignment that they struggle to make practical decisions or to engage with the external world in concrete ways. Moreover, the hero function, when overdeveloped or too identified with the ego, can become inflated. The individual begins to believe that their way of seeing is the only valid way, that their function is superior to all others. The extroverted thinking type might dismiss feeling as weakness or illogical sentimentality. The introverted feeling type might judge others as inauthentic or superficial because they don't share the same depth of internal value processing. This inflation of the hero function is a sign that the personality is out of balance, that the other functions are not being given their due. The auxiliary or parent function provides some balance to the hero. If the hero is dominant in one attitude, say extroversion, then the parent function will typically be in the opposite attitude, introversion. And if the hero is a rational function like thinking or feeling, the parent will be an irrational function like intuition or sensation, or vice versa. This provides a kind of complementarity. The parent function, as its name suggests, has a supporting, nurturing, or structuring quality. It helps the hero function do its work more effectively. It provides backup, assistance, a second opinion. When we are using our parent function, we feel helpful, responsible, supportive, both toward ourselves and toward others. An extroverted thinking type, for example, might have introverted intuition as their parent function. While their hero function organizes the external world logically, their parent function perceives patterns, implications, future possibilities in the internal realm. This introverted intuition supports the extroverted thinking by providing strategic insight, by seeing where current systems are heading, by detecting the deeper patterns beneath surface events. The individual might pride themselves on being not just efficient, but visionary, not just organizing what is, but anticipating what will be. The parent function can also have a somewhat dutiful quality. It is something we feel we should do, something we feel responsible for providing. If the hero function is what we do naturally and joyfully, the parent function is what we do reliably and responsibly. It may not have quite the same spontaneous energy as the hero, but it is steady, dependable, trustworthy. Yet the parent function, too, can become distorted. When overused or stressed, it can take on the quality of the negative parent, the critical, demanding, overbearing parent who imposes their way on others. This is particularly likely to happen when the parent function is directed outward toward others rather than being used in service of the self. The extroverted thinking type with auxiliary introverted intuition might become the person who is always telling others what their strategy should be, always imposing their vision, always insisting that they can see the future and others had better follow their lead. The third function, the puer or puella, the eternal child, brings a quality of playfulness and creativity, but also unpredictability and naivety. This is a function that is less developed than the first two, one that we access more sporadically, often when we are relaxed or in a playful mood. It has the charm and the limitations of childhood. For our extroverted thinking type, this third function might be extroverted, feeling the expression of emotion and values in relationship with others. When this person is relaxed, when they are not in work mode, when they are with close friends or family, They might suddenly become quite warm and emotionally expressive. They might delight in making others feel good, in creating a positive emotional atmosphere. But this extroverted feeling has a childlike quality to it. It is not as nuanced or skilled as it would be in someone for whom it was the hero function. The person might overdo it, becoming effusive or sentimental in a way that feels slightly off. Or they might suddenly withdraw this function when they feel vulnerable, retreating back to the safety of their thinking function. The child function is also where we can be wounded, or where we act out. It is a place of vulnerability in the personality. If someone criticizes or mocks our child function, we may react with surprising intensity, feeling hurt or defensive in a way that seems disproportionate. This is because the child function is connected to our sense of innocence, of possibility, of who we might become if we were to develop more fully. As we develop and mature, we may gradually integrate the child function more fully, allowing it to grow up, as it were, without losing its essential quality of playfulness and creativity. This integration is part of the individuation process, part of becoming whole. But it is work that requires consciousness and effort. It does not happen automatically. And then we come to the fourth function, the inferior function, which Beebe associates with the anima or animus archetype. This function has received more attention in Jungian literature than any of the other non-dominant functions, because Jung himself recognized its particular importance. The inferior function is the function that is most repressed, most undeveloped, most dissociated from ego consciousness. It is opposite to the hero function in every way opposite, in both type thinking versus feeling, intuition versus sensation, and attitude, extroverted versus introverted. For our extroverted thinking type, the inferior function would be introverted feeling, that deep internal world of personal values and emotional authenticity. This is the domain where our hypothetical extroverted thinking type feels most incompetent, most uncomfortable, most vulnerable. They may avoid introspection, avoid deep questions about what they truly value or feel. When they do encounter this realm, it may overwhelm them. They may be swept away by emotions they don't understand, may find themselves in the grip of moods that seem to come from nowhere, may make value judgments that are surprisingly rigid or sentimental. Jung called these experiences of the inferior function being in the grip. When we are in the grip of the inferior function, we lose our usual competence and control. We act in ways that are unlike our usual self, that may embarrass us or confuse us. The normally logical and efficient extroverted thinking type might suddenly burst into tears over something that seems trivial, or might become stubbornly attached to a value position that they cannot rationally justify, or might withdraw into brooding introspection. These experiences, uncomfortable as they are, serve a vital purpose in the psyche. The inferior function is the gateway to the unconscious. It is where the ego's control ends and something else begins, something autonomous, something that belongs to the deeper layers of the psyche. In Jungian terms, the inferior function connects us to the anima or animus, that figure of the opposite gender that represents the unconscious dimension of the personality, the soul image, the guide to the inner world. When we are in relationship with someone who lives easily in the realm of our inferior function, we may experience them as fascinating, magnetic, numinous. They seem to possess something we lack, something we long for. This is the basis of much romantic attraction. We fall in love with someone who embodies our inferior function, who seems to live naturally in the realm where we ourselves are most vulnerable and least developed. The extroverted thinking type falls for the introverted feeling type, who seems to possess such depth of authentic emotion, such clarity about values, such inner richness. The introverted feeling type falls for the extroverted thinking type, who seems so capable of taking charge, of organizing the world, of making things happen. This attraction, powerful as it is, contains within it the seeds of difficulty. If we do not recognize that we are projecting our own undeveloped function onto the other, we may eventually become disappointed when we realize that the beloved is not the perfect embodiment of our soul image, but an actual human being with their own complexities and limitations. Or we may become resentful, unconsciously feeling that the beloved should carry our inferior function for us, should provide what we ourselves have not developed. The work of individuation requires, eventually, withdrawing these projections, recognizing that the qualities we admire in the other are also potential qualities within ourselves. This does not mean that we will ever develop our inferior function to the level of someone for whom it is dominant. The inferior function tends to remain inferior throughout life, but we can develop a relationship with it, can learn to access it consciously when needed, can integrate it sufficiently that it no longer overwhelms us or remains split off in the unconscious. These first four functions, hero, parent, child, and anima. Animas constitute what Beebe calls the spine functions. They form the ego structure, the conscious personality, the self that we identify with and present to the world. They are the functions that appear in descriptions of the 16 Myers-Briggs types. But Beebe's model does not stop here. There are four more functions, four shadow functions that mirror the ego structure, but operate in the opposite attitude. The fifth function, which Beebe calls the opposing personality or nemesis, is the same type as the hero function, but in the opposite attitude. If your hero is extroverted thinking, your opposing personality is introverted thinking. This function emerges when we feel challenged or threatened, when someone opposes our hero function or questions our competence in that domain. The opposing personality is defensive, oppositional, stubborn. It digs in its heels. It resists. Imagine our extroverted thinking type in a meeting where someone challenges the logic of their proposal. Instead of considering the challenge openly, they might suddenly become very internally logical, very concerned with the internal consistency of their argument, very focused on proving that their thinking is sound. They become rigid, defensive, unable to engage flexibly with the challenge. This is the opposing personality at work, introverted, thinking being used not in service of genuine reflection, but in defense of the ego against perceived attack. The opposing personality can also emerge in situations where we need to oppose something unhealthy or defend appropriate boundaries. It is not purely negative. There are times when we need to dig in our heels, to resist pressure, to stand our ground. The key is consciousness. Can we use this function deliberately and appropriately, or does it seize control of us automatically whenever we feel threatened? The sixth function, the critical parent or witch, senex, is the same type as the auxiliary function but in the opposite attitude. This is the voice of harsh judgment and criticism. It is the negative parent who finds fault, who shames, who says, you should and you shouldn't. For our extroverted thinking type with auxiliary introverted intuition, the critical parent would be extroverted intuition. This might manifest as a harsh, critical voice that sees all the negative possibilities, all the ways things could go wrong, all the potential disasters lurking in the future. Where healthy, extroverted intuition sees exciting possibilities and connections between ideas, the critical parent version becomes catastrophizing and cynical. The person might hear an internal voice saying things like, "You're never going to succeed at this," or "Can't you see that everyone thinks you're incompetent?" or "All these possibilities and you're going to fail at every single one of them." This critical parent function is often projected onto others. We hear in their words or expressions or tone of voice the criticism and judgment that actually comes from our own shadow. We may accuse others of being judgmental when we ourselves are the harshest judge, or we may attract into our lives people who genuinely embody this critical energy, who act out the negative parent role for us until we can recognize it and take it back as our own. The seventh function, the trickster, is the same type as the child function but in the opposite attitude. This is the part of the psyche that creates double binds, that sabotages us in foolish or embarrassing ways, that gets us into trouble through mischief or clumsiness or ill-timed spontaneity. For our extroverted thinking type, the trickster would be introverted feeling. This might show up as the person who prides themselves on logical objectivity suddenly becoming irrationally attached to a personal value or feeling in a way that undermines their position. Or it might manifest as social awkwardness in situations requiring emotional sensitivity, saying exactly the wrong thing at the wrong time, missing social cues, offending people without intending to. The trickster is not malicious, but it is disruptive. It has the quality of the trickster gods in mythology, Hermes, Loki, Coyote, who create chaos and confusion, but who also, through their disruptions, bring about necessary change and new awareness. When the trickster trips us up, when it leads us to make a fool of ourselves, it may be pointing to something that needs to change, some rigidity in the ego structure that needs to be loosened, some shadow content that needs to come into consciousness. And finally, we come to the eighth function, the daemon or demon, which Beebe sometimes called the destructive function. This is the opposite of the hero function, in every way opposite function type, opposite attitude. It is the most deeply repressed, the most autonomous, the most potentially dangerous function. For our extroverted thinking type, this would be introverted feeling weight. That sounds like the inferior function, doesn't it? Here is where the subtlety of Beebe's model becomes important. The inferior function, the anima, animus, is the same function but approached from the ego side. It is the function that the ego knows it lacks, that it feels inferior about, that it may idealize or project. The eighth function, the daemon, is the same function approached from the deep unconscious. It is not just undeveloped, but actively repressed, not just weak, but dangerous. Let me correct that example I misspoke in my illustration. For an extroverted thinking type, the inferior function, fourth function, would indeed be introverted feeling. But the eighth function, the daemon, would be. Let me think through the architecture carefully. In Beebe's model, the 8 functions form 2 parallel structures. The first 4 are the ego functions in the preferred attitude, plus the complementary opposite functions. The second 4 are the shadow versions of these same function types, but opposite attitudes. So for an extroverted thinking type whose function order is, first, extroverted thinking, hero; second, introverted intuition, parent; third, extroverted sensation, child; Fourth, introverted feeling, anima, animus. The shadow functions would be: fifth, introverted thinking, opposing personality. Sixth, extroverted intuition, critical parent. Seventh, introverted sensation, trickster. And eighth, extroverted feeling, demon. Ah, yes, so the daemon for this type would be extroverted feeling, not introverted feeling. The daemon is the opposite of the hero function. So if the hero is extroverted thinking, the daemon is extroverted feeling. The daemon function, when it erupts into consciousness, can be catastrophic. It represents values, perceptions, or ways of being that are completely at odds with the ego's identity. When it possesses us, and that is not too strong a word, we may act in ways that are completely uncharacteristic, destructive, seemingly demonic. Our extroverted thinking type, when possessed by demon extroverted feeling, might have a breakdown in which they become overwhelmed by the emotional needs and reactions of others, might make desperate attempts to make everyone happy that backfire disastrously, might lose all sense of logical structure and become swept up in emotional chaos. Or they might project dysfunction onto others, seeing certain people or groups as dangerously emotional, manipulative, driven by feeling rather than reason, and therefore needing to be controlled or suppressed. Yet even this eighth function, dangerous as it may be, has its place in the psyche. Jung taught that the goal is not to eliminate the shadow, but to integrate it, to bring it into relationship with consciousness. The daemon function, when recognized and gradually integrated, can become a source of renewal and transformation. It represents the most foreign territory of the psyche, but also the place where the greatest potential for growth lies. This, then, is the complete architecture of Beebe's 8-function model. 8 function attitudes, each associated with a specific archetype, forming 2 parallel structures of ego and shadow. It is a model of extraordinary complexity and depth, one that honors both the structure and the dynamism of the psyche, both the patterns and the particularity of individual personality. But Beebe did not develop this model merely as an intellectual exercise. He understood it as a practical tool for psychological work, for understanding ourselves and others, for navigating relationships and conflicts, for the process of individuation. Let us consider how this model illuminates some of the central challenges of human life and relationship. One of the most important applications of Beebe's model is in understanding projection. Projection, in Jungian psychology, is the process by which we attribute to others contents of our own psyche that we are not conscious of in ourselves. We see in the other person qualities, motives, or characteristics that are actually our own, particularly qualities that belong to our shadow. Beebe's model gives us a precise map of projection dynamics. We are most likely to project our shadow functions, particularly the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th functions, onto others. And we tend to project them onto people who genuinely embody those functions in their ego structure, which creates a resonance that makes the projection feel real and justified. Consider a relationship between an introverted feeling type, for whom introverted feeling is the hero function, and an extroverted thinking type, for whom introverted feeling is the inferior function. The introverted feeling type lives naturally in that realm of deep values and authentic emotion. The extroverted thinking type is vulnerable and undeveloped in that realm. It is their inferior function. At first, the extroverted thinking type, may idealize the introverted feeling type, may see in them a depth and authenticity that seems magical or numinous. This is projection of the anima. Anima's function, the beloved carries the inferior function that connects the ego to the unconscious. There is a powerful attraction, a sense of completion, a feeling that the other person possesses something essential that one lacks oneself. But as the relationship develops, other dynamics may emerge. The extroverted thinking type may begin to feel frustrated with the introverted feeling type's way of operating. Why are they so concerned with authenticity and values? Why can't they just make a practical decision? Why do they withdraw into their inner world rather than engaging with external reality? This irritation may activate the critical parent function of the extroverted thinking type, extroverted intuition in its negative form, which begins to see all sorts of negative possibilities, begins to criticize and find fault. Meanwhile, the introverted feeling type may feel that the extroverted thinking type is inauthentic, superficial, overly focused on external organization at the expense of inner depth. They may withdraw further into their introverted feeling, which activates the opposing personality of the extroverted thinking type. Introverted thinking, which becomes defensive and rigid, insisting on the internal consistency and soundness of their logical approach. The conflict escalates. Each person is now operating partly from shadow functions, partly in response to genuine differences in type, partly projecting their own unintegrated functions onto the other. The relationship that began with mutual fascination has become a battlefield of typological conflict. Beebe's model provides a way to understand and potentially resolve such conflicts. If both parties can become aware of the typological dynamics at play, if they can recognize their projections and withdraw them, if they can appreciate that the other person's dominant function is their own inferior or shadow function and vice versa, then the conflict can be transformed into an opportunity for growth. The extroverted thinking type can recognize that their irritation with the introverted feeling type is partly a reflection of their own discomfort with that function, their own need to develop greater access to it. The introverted feeling type can recognize that their judgment of the extroverted thinking type as inauthentic may be a projection of their own critical parent function, and that there is value in the extroverted thinking approach that complements their own way of being. This is difficult work. It requires honesty, self-awareness, and willingness to acknowledge parts of ourselves that we would prefer not to see. It requires what Jung called taking back the projections, recognizing that what we see in the other is also, and perhaps primarily, something in ourselves. But when this work is done, when projections are withdrawn and shadow functions are gradually integrated, the relationship can become a vehicle for individuation rather than a source of ongoing conflict. The other person is no longer required to carry our inferior function for us. We begin to develop it ourselves. The other person is no longer the target of our shadow projections. We begin to own our own critical parent, our own trickster, our own daemon. Beebe also explored how typological dynamics play out in groups and organizations. Every group has a typological culture, a collective preference for certain functions over others. Some organizations value and reward thinking over feeling, judging over perceiving, extroversion over introversion. People whose type aligns with the organizational culture tend to thrive and advance. People whose type is at odds with the culture may struggle, may feel undervalued, may eventually leave. Understanding these dynamics can help create more diverse and functional organizations. If leaders are aware of typological differences, they can ensure that all functions are represented and valued, that decisions are informed by thinking and feeling, by intuition and sensation, by both introverted and extroverted perspectives. They can recognize that what looks like resistance or poor performance may actually be a typological mismatch, and they can work to create roles and structures that allow different types to contribute their particular gifts. Beebe's use of film analysis as a teaching tool also reflects a deep understanding of how psychological dynamics work in narrative. Every story, in some sense, is a story about the psyche. The hero of the tale is the ego. The other characters represent different aspects of the psyche or different typological functions. And the journey of the narrative is the journey of individuation, the quest for wholeness, the integration of the shadow, the confrontation with the self. Consider the archetypal hero's journey as outlined by Joseph Campbell: departure, initiation, return. The hero begins in the ordinary world, receives a call to adventure, crosses a threshold into the unknown, faces trials and challenges, encounters helpers and adversaries, descends to the deepest point, the ordeal, receives a reward or boon, and returns transformed to the ordinary world. This narrative pattern appears across cultures and throughout history because it maps onto the psychological process of individuation. In typological terms, we might understand this journey as beginning with the hero function, the protagonist's dominant way of engaging with the world. The call to adventure often requires leaving behind the safety of the hero function and developing other functions. The helpers the hero encounters may represent auxiliary or tertiary functions that need to be developed. The adversaries may represent shadow functions that need to be confronted and integrated. The ordeal often involves a confrontation with inferior function, the realm where the hero is most vulnerable, and the return represents the integration of these various functions into a more complete personality. Beebe would screen films with his students and demonstrate these dynamics in action. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker begins as a young man, dominated by extroverted sensation. He's eager for adventure, for action, for sensory experience. His journey requires developing introverted intuition, Yoda's training in feeling the Force, entrusting inner knowing, and eventually confronting his shadow, Darth Vader, as the Dark Father, the rejected and destructive aspect of his own potential. In The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's journey home requires gathering and integrating different functions: the Scarecrow's thinking, the Tin Man's feeling, the Lion's courage, perhaps intuition as the capacity to see beyond immediate fear to deeper truth. The wizard himself is a false father figure, an inflation of the ego that must be seen through, and the true path home requires recognizing that she had the power all along, a recognition of the self, the deeper center of the psyche. These film analyses were not mere entertainment or illustration. They trained students to see psychological dynamics in action, to recognize how functions and archetypes operate in human behavior and relationship. They demonstrated that psychology is not just an abstract theoretical system, but a living reality that shows up in stories, in interactions, in the unfolding drama of human life. Beebe's work also has profound implications for understanding psychological development across the lifespan. In Jungian psychology, the first half of life is typically focused on ego development, establishing oneself in the world, developing career and relationships, building a functional personality. The second half of life, particularly after midlife, shifts toward individuation, integrating the shadow, developing the inferior function, connecting with the self, preparing for death, and the completion of the life cycle. In typological terms, the first half of life tends to emphasize the development of the dominant and auxiliary functions. We become good at what we're naturally good at. We find careers and relationships that allow us to use our hero and parent functions effectively. We build an identity around these functions. I am a logical person. I am an intuitive person. I am a feeling person. But at midlife, something shifts. Jung called it the midlife crisis, but it's better understood as the midlife transition or awakening. The ego structure that served us well in the first half of life begins to feel confining. We become restless, dissatisfied, aware of unlived possibilities. We may feel called to develop parts of ourselves that have been neglected, to explore domains of experience that we have avoided. In typological terms, this often involves the inferior function beginning to make its demands known. The successful business executive who has relied entirely on extroverted thinking may suddenly feel drawn to art, to music, to introspection, to the realm of introverted feeling. The devoted homemaker who has expressed herself primarily through extroverted feeling may feel called to develop her own thinking, her own logic, her own capacity to make decisions independent of others' needs and reactions. This is not a rejection of the ego structure built in the first half of life, but an expansion of it, a movement toward wholeness. The functions that have been dominant do not disappear or become less important. Rather, they are now complemented and balanced by the development of previously repressed functions. This development is never easy. The inferior function remains inferior. We do not become as skilled with it as someone for whom it is dominant. But we can develop a relationship with it, can learn to access it when needed, can appreciate its gifts even as we acknowledge our limitations in that domain. The shadow functions, too, may become more conscious and integrated in the second half of life. The opposing personality, the critical parent, the trickster, even the demon, these figures that operated autonomously in the unconscious, may gradually be brought into awareness, their energy no longer directed destructively, but channeled toward creativity and growth. Beebe understood that this individuation process is not automatic. It requires consciousness, effort, and often the support of analysis or some other form of deep psychological work. It requires willingness to face what is uncomfortable, to acknowledge what has been repressed, to engage with the shadow rather than projecting it onto others. But for those who undertake this work, the rewards are profound. There is a greater sense of wholeness, of authenticity, of living one's own life, rather than a life defined by collective expectations or unconscious patterns. There is a capacity for deeper relationships, for real intimacy rather than projection-based fascination. There is a creativity that comes from accessing a wider range of functions and perspectives. And there is a spiritual dimension, a sense of alignment with something deeper than ego, what Jung called the self. The self, in Jungian psychology, is the center and totality of the psyche, the archetype of wholeness and meaning. It is both the center we start from the psyche in its entirety, including both conscious and unconscious, and the goal we strive toward through the process of individuation. The self is transpersonal, greater than the ego, yet intimately connected to who we most deeply are. In typological terms, we might say that the self is not bound by type. It encompasses all functions, all attitudes, all archetypal energies. The process of individuation, of developing and integrating all 8 functions, is a movement toward greater alignment with the self, toward expressing more fully the wholeness that we are in potential. This is why Beebe saw typology not as a way of labeling or limiting people, but as a language for self-understanding and growth. To know one's type is not to be trapped by it, but to understand one's natural gifts and limitations, to recognize where development is needed, to appreciate the typological diversity of others, and to engage consciously with the journey toward wholeness. Beebe's restoration of archetypal depth to typology means that we understand each function not just as a cognitive process, but as a character in the drama of personality, as a face of the psyche with its own wisdom and its own shadow. The hero function is not just our strength. It is the heroic aspect of our personality, the part that faces challenges with courage. The inferior function is not just our weakness, it is the soul figure, the anima or animus, that connects us to the unconscious and to dimensions of experience beyond the ego's control. This archetypal understanding makes typology mythological. We're not just INTJ or ESFP. We are living out a particular mythic pattern, a particular arrangement of archetypal energies. Our personality is a story being told, a drama being enacted. And like all myths and dramas, it has its themes, its conflicts, its potential for tragedy or comedy or transformation. Beebe's workshops and lectures often had this quality of bringing typology to life, of making it feel like a living language rather than a technical classification system. Students would report that after learning Beebe's model, they could not help but see the 8 archetypes in action everywhere in themselves, in their relationships, in films and novels, in the public figures and leaders who shape our culture. This kind of seeing is a gift of psychological education. It makes the invisible visible. It gives us language and concepts to articulate dynamics that we might have sensed intuitively but could not name or understand. It transforms confusion into clarity, reactivity into reflection, conflict into opportunity for growth. But Beebe was also aware of the limitations and dangers of typology. Any system that categorizes people runs the risk of becoming reductive, of turning complex human beings into labels, of limiting rather than liberating understanding. Beebe emphasized that type is a tool, not a definition. It describes patterns, not destinies. It illuminates certain dynamics, but does not capture the totality of any individual person. Moreover, Beebe recognized that typology can be misused defensively. People may use their type as an excuse for not developing certain functions. I'm a thinking type, so I don't do emotions. Or I'm an intuitive type, so I don't bother with practical details. This is not individuation but inflation, not self-understanding but self-limitation. The proper use of typology, Beebe taught, is in service of greater awareness and greater wholeness. It helps us understand why certain things come easily and others are difficult. It helps us appreciate that others' ways of seeing and being are not wrong, but different. It helps us identify where our growth edges are, where we need to develop, where we are likely to encounter shadow and projection. And it helps us see personality itself as a spiritual task, a calling to become more fully who we are in potential. Let us linger for a while longer on the shadow. For this is perhaps the most crucial aspect of Beebe's work. The shadow, as Jung understood it, is not evil. It is simply the aspects of ourselves that have been excluded from ego consciousness. Some of these aspects may be genuinely problematic: destructive impulses, selfish desires, cruel judgments. But much of the shadow consists of potential that has been repressed, gifts that have not been developed, creativity that has been squelched because it did not fit with the ego ideal or the collective expectations. In typological terms, the shadow functions are not inherently negative. They are simply less conscious, less developed, less integrated than the ego functions. The opposing personality, for instance, can be a vital resource for maintaining boundaries and resisting inappropriate pressure, but only if we can access it consciously rather than having it seize control of us reactively. The critical parent function, for all its harshness, may point to real standards and values that need to be maintained, but only if we can distinguish between appropriate discrimination and destructive judgment. The trickster function, for all its disruptiveness, may bring needed flexibility and humor, but only if we can work with it rather than being undermined by it. Even the daemon function, dangerous as it may be, represents dimensions of life and experience that are essential to wholeness. The shadow wants to be integrated. This is one of the fundamental insights of Jungian psychology. The shadow is not an enemy to be defeated, but an estranged part of ourselves, seeking recognition and reunion. When we reject the shadow, when we refuse to acknowledge its existence, when we project it entirely onto others, it becomes autonomous and dangerous. It acts out in unconscious ways. It returns in symptoms, in conflicts, in self-sabotage. But when we turn toward the shadow, when we acknowledge it, when we begin to integrate it, it becomes a source of energy and creativity. The repressed inferior function, when gradually developed, adds depth and balance to the personality. The shadow functions, when brought into consciousness, expand our range of responses and perceptions. This integration is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. New situations, new relationships, new stages of life will activate different shadow contents, will call different functions into play. The work of knowing oneself, of integrating the shadow, is never complete. It is the work of a lifetime. Beebe's model provides a map for this work, but maps are not territories. The actual journey of integrating shadow functions, of developing the inferior function, of bringing the 8 archetypes into conscious relationship, is a deeply personal and often difficult process. It may require therapy or analysis. It certainly requires honesty with oneself, willingness to see what is uncomfortable, courage to change habitual patterns. It also requires compassion for ourselves and for others. If we understand that each type has its gifts and limitations, that each person is wrestling with their own shadow functions and trying to integrate their own inferior function, then we can approach both ourselves and others with greater patience and kindness. We can recognize that the annoying behaviors of others may be expressions of their shadow functions, just as our own shadow behaviors annoy others. We can appreciate that wholeness is a goal we are all striving toward, not a state that anyone has fully achieved. Now, we have explored the structure of Beebe's model, its applications to projection and relationship and development. But let us step back and consider the broader significance of this work, its place in the larger story of psychology and human self-understanding. let us drift into the philosophical and spiritual dimensions of what it means to see personality as myth, to understand the psyche as a drama enacted among archetypal figures. Beebe's work stands at a crossroads in the history of psychology. On one side is the tradition of scientific psychology, quantitative, objective, seeking universal laws of behavior and cognition. On the other side is the tradition of depth psychology, qualitative, subjective, seeking meaning and wholeness, and the integration of the individual. Beebe bridges these traditions. His model has structure and precision. It can be taught and learned systematically. It makes predictions about how different types will interact. Yet it also honors the mythological dimension, the archetypal realm, the mystery of the individual soul. This bridge is important because psychology has, throughout its history, been tempted to reduce the psyche to something less than it is. Behaviorism reduced psychology to observable behavior, eliminating consciousness and interiority altogether. Cognitive science reduces mind to information processing, to computation. Neuroscience reduces consciousness to brain states. These reductions yield important insights and have their place, but they cannot capture the fullness of human experience, the sense of meaning, the feeling of soul, the experience of being a self that endures through time and change. Jungian psychology and Beebe's work within that tradition insists that the psyche is irreducible. It is not just behavior or cognition or neural activity. It is a realm unto itself, with its own patterns and dynamics, its own purposes and teleology. The psyche seeks wholeness. It seeks meaning. It seeks expression and relationship. It speaks in images and symbols and stories. It cannot be fully captured by scientific measurement, though science can illuminate aspects of it. This insistence on the reality and autonomy of the psyche is, in a sense, a return to an older wisdom. Ancient cultures understood human nature through myth, through archetypal stories of gods and heroes and quests for transformation. They understood that within each person lived multiple voices, multiple souls, multiple potentials. The Greek idea of the daimon, the Roman idea of genius, the Egyptian idea of the ka, these were all ways of acknowledging that the self is not singular and simple, that we contain multitudes, that we are in dialogue with forces greater than our conscious ego. Modern psychology, in its effort to be scientific, initially rejected this older wisdom as superstition. But Jung, and Beebe following him, recognized that the myths and symbols of ancient cultures were not false beliefs about external reality, but true insights into internal reality, into the structure and dynamics of the psyche itself. When we speak of the hero archetype, we are not claiming that there is an actual hero residing in the psyche like a little person. Rather, we are recognizing that there is a pattern of energy and behavior that appears across individuals and cultures, a pattern that carries the quality of heroism, courage, confrontation with challenge, identity formation through action. By calling it the hero, by naming it with a mythological figure, we acknowledge its archetypal nature, its transpersonal quality, its connection to human experience across time and space. Similarly, when Beebe says that the dominant function carries the hero archetype, he is not merely creating an interesting metaphor. He is identifying a real pattern in how this function operates psychologically. The dominant function does carry the ego's sense of agency and competence. It is the function through which we feel ourselves to be heroic, capable of facing the world's challenges. This is observable, testable, verifiable in clinical experience and in careful self-observation. But the archetypal language also adds something that purely technical language cannot capture. It adds soul, depth, connection to the larger human story. When I recognize that my dominant function carries the hero, archetype, I am not just understanding a cognitive preference. I am situating myself in a mythic drama. I am the hero of my own story. And I understand that this role comes with both gifts and challenges, with both glory and shadow. This restoration of mythic language to psychology is profoundly countercultural in an age that tends to reduce everything to mechanism and matter. It insists that meaning is real, that archetype is real, that the soul is real not as metaphors or constructs, but as dimensions of existence that are as primary as the physical world. Yet, this is not a retreat into mysticism or irrationalism. Beebe's model is precise, structured, grounded in observation. It does not require belief in anything supernatural or immaterial. One can understand archetypes as patterns that emerge from human experience, as ways that the brain-mind system organizes itself, as cultural psychological structures, or one can understand them in more metaphysical terms, as autonomous, psychic realities that transcend the individual. The model works either way. This flexibility, this ability to speak to both the skeptic and the believer, is part of what makes Jungian psychology so valuable. It provides a language that bridges science and spirituality, that honors both the material and the meaningful, that respects both the empirical and the experiential. In Beebe's work, we see this bridge operating particularly clearly in how he connects popular typology with depth psychology. The Myers-Briggs type indicator is widely used in organizational settings, in career counseling, in education. Millions of people have taken it and found value in understanding their type. But as typically taught and used, it remains on the surface a useful tool for understanding preferences and communication styles, but not a path to transformation. Beebe shows how typology can be deepened, how it can become a tool for individuation rather than just a tool for adjustment. By adding the archetypal dimension, by including the shadow functions, by showing how type is not static but dynamic and developmental, he transforms typology from a personality test into a map of the soul's journey. This transformation matters because it makes typology relevant to the deepest questions of human existence. Who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose? What does it mean to live a good life? These are not questions that can be answered by knowing whether you prefer extroversion or introversion, but they can be illuminated by understanding how your particular typological structure shapes your experience. What functions need to be developed? What shadow contents need to be integrated? How your personality pattern relates to the archetypal patterns that have guided human development across cultures and throughout history. The question, who am I, receives a complex answer through Beebe's lens. You are not just your dominant function, not just your conscious ego. You are the totality of all 8 function attitudes, all 8 archetypal characters in the drama of your personality. You are the hero, yes, but also the parent, the child, the anima or animus. You are also your shadow, the opposing personality, the critical parent, the trickster, the demon. All of these are you. Wholeness means not identifying exclusively with the ego functions, but recognizing and integrating the shadow functions as well. This is a radical and challenging answer. It means that the person who irritates you most may be showing you your own shadow. It means that your greatest weakness is also the gateway to your greatest potential. It means that the path to wholeness requires confronting what you would rather avoid, developing what you have neglected, acknowledging what you have repressed. But it is also a liberating answer. It means you are not trapped by your type. It means you contain possibilities you have not yet lived. It means the annoying, difficult, shadow parts of yourself are not evidence of failure, but opportunities for growth. It means your personality is not a fixed structure, but a living process, always capable of development and transformation. The question, "What is my purpose?" also receives illumination through typological understanding. One's purpose is not separate from one's type. It is expressed through it. The extroverted thinking type's purpose will involve organizing, structuring, bringing logical order to the external world. The introverted feeling type's purpose will involve living authentically, maintaining alignment with deep values, bringing depth and integrity to relationships and endeavors. But purpose is not limited to the dominant function. Indeed, the greatest sense of purpose often comes from the integration of opposites, from the development of the inferior function, from the embrace of the shadow. The executive who has relied entirely on thinking may find profound purpose in developing feeling, in learning to respond to the human dimension of leadership. The artist who has lived entirely in the realm of introverted intuition may find new purpose in developing sensation, in grounding their vision in concrete form. Jung spoke of the second half of life as a time when questions of meaning become paramount, when we ask not what can I achieve, but who am I meant to become. This is the shift from ego to self, from personal ambition to transpersonal purpose, and it is often catalyzed by the activation of the inferior function and the shadow, by the psyche's demand that we become more whole. The question, what does it mean to live a good life, is perhaps the ultimate question of ethics and spirituality. Beebe's model suggests that living well requires several things. First, it requires living in accordance with one's type, honoring one's natural gifts and inclinations, not trying to be something one is not. The introverted feeling type will never thrive by trying to live like an extroverted thinking type, and vice versa. Authenticity, alignment with one's true nature, is essential. But second, living well requires developing beyond one's type, integrating the inferior function, bringing shadow functions into consciousness, expanding the range of one's capacities. A good life is not lived entirely from the dominant function, no matter how skillful one becomes with it. A good life requires balance, wholeness, the ability to access different functions as situations require. Third, living well requires understanding and compassion for those of other types. The world needs all types, all functions. The feeling types bring values and human connection. The thinking types bring logic and structure. The intuitive types bring vision and possibility. The sensation types bring practicality and groundedness. No one type is superior to others. Each has gifts to offer and limitations to acknowledge. In this sense, Beebe's work has profound ethical implications. If we understand that typological differences are real and valuable, we become more tolerant of diversity, more appreciative of different approaches, less likely to insist that everyone should be like us. We recognize that what looks like stubbornness or incompetence in another person may simply be a different typological approach, one that has its own validity even if it differs from ours. At the same time, we become less tolerant of unconscious shadow behavior, both in ourselves and others. We can recognize when someone is operating from their critical parent or their daemon, when projection is distorting perception, when unintegrated shadow contents are creating conflict. We can call for greater consciousness, for the withdrawal of projections, for the integration of shadow, not in a judgmental way, but with compassion, recognizing that this is the work we are all called to do. These ethical dimensions connect to what Jung called the moral aspect of the individuation process. Individuation is not just psychological development, it is moral development, spiritual development. It requires taking responsibility for one's own shadow rather than projecting it onto others. It requires honoring the reality of the self rather than inflating the ego. It requires contributing one's gifts to the collective rather than using one's psychological understanding merely for personal advantage. Beebe, in his book Integrity in Depth, explored these ethical dimensions extensively. He showed how each type has its own characteristic way of maintaining or losing integrity, its own particular temptations toward shadow behavior. The thinking types may lose integrity through a lack of feeling awareness, through decisions that are technically correct but humanly callous. The feeling types may lose integrity through lack of thinking discrimination, through decisions that feel right but are objectively unfair or illogical. Integrity, in Beebe's understanding, is not conformity to external rules but alignment between consciousness and the unconscious, between ego and self. It requires honoring the demands of both the dominant and the inferior function, both the ego and the shadow. It requires living not just from what is easy and natural, the dominant function, but also engaging with what is difficult and challenging, the inferior function and the shadow. This is a high standard, one that none of us consistently meets. But it is a direction, a telos, a goal toward which we can strive. And the very act of striving, of engaging consciously with the work of integration, is itself meaningful. It is how we participate in the larger process of psychic evolution, how we contribute to the growing consciousness of humanity. Here we arrive at a more speculative but important dimension of Beebe's work, its implications for understanding collective psychology and cultural evolution. If individuals have typological structures, do cultures and societies also have typological preferences? Jung thought so, and many observers have noted that different cultures seem to favor different functions and attitudes. American culture, for instance, has historically favored extroversion, sensation, thinking, and judging the ESTJ type, one might say. American society values action over contemplation, practical results over abstract theory, logical efficiency over emotional depth, structure and decisiveness over openness and spontaneity. This typological bias has created a culture of tremendous energy, innovation, and material progress. But it has also meant that other functions, particularly introverted feeling, with its emphasis on inner values and authenticity, have been undervalued or repressed in the collective. Other cultures show different patterns. Many Asian cultures favor introversion, thinking, and judging, but with more emphasis on harmony and collective values than on individual achievement. Some European cultures show strong preferences for intuition and feeling, valuing art, philosophy, emotional expression, and quality of life over purely material measures of success. These cultural typological patterns are not absolute, of course. Every culture contains individuals of every type, and cultures change over time. But recognizing these patterns helps us understand cultural conflicts and misunderstandings. When cultures clash, they are often clashing over typological differences, over what functions and attitudes are valued, over what constitutes success or virtue or the good life. Just as individuals have shadows, cultures have collective shadows. The functions and attitudes that a culture represses do not disappear. They emerge in destructive or distorted ways. American culture's repression of introverted feeling, for instance, might be seen in the epidemic of depression and anxiety, the crisis of meaning and authenticity, the sense of alienation and emptiness that many people experience despite material prosperity. Similarly, cultures that repress thinking in favor of feeling or that repress sensation in favor of intuition will manifest characteristic shadow symptoms. No culture is balanced. No culture values all functions equally. And so every culture is, in a sense, undergoing its own individuation process, being called, through crisis and conflict, to integrate what has been repressed, to develop what has been neglected, to move toward greater wholeness. This perspective transforms how we think about history and social change. Cultural movements and revolutions can be understood, in part, as expressions of repressed functions demanding recognition. The Romantic movement of the 19th century was, in typological terms, a rebellion of feeling and intuition against the dominance of thinking and sensation in the Enlightenment. The counterculture of the 1960s was, among other things, a rebellion of introverted feeling against the extroverted thinking culture of post-war America. These movements do not represent the complete answer. They often swing too far in the opposite direction, repressing what the dominant culture had valued. But they are necessary correctives, ways that the collective psyche seeks balance, ways that repressed functions assert their importance. In our current era, we may be witnessing another such shift. The rise of concern for emotional intelligence, for mindfulness and introspection, for authenticity and meaning over material success. These may represent introverted feeling and other previously repressed functions, making their demands known in the collective psyche. At the same time, we see counter-movements defending traditional, extroverted thinking, values of logic, order, hierarchy, and objective truth. Understanding these dynamics typologically does not resolve the conflicts, but it may help us engage with them more consciously. If we recognize that both sides of a cultural divide represent valid functions and approaches, we may be able to move beyond simplistic either-or thinking to a both-and integration. We need both thinking and feeling, both extroversion and introversion, both tradition and innovation. The challenge is not to choose one over the other, but to integrate them, to find ways that different functions and types can coexist and complement each other. This brings us to one of the deepest insights of Beebe's work, that typology is ultimately about relationship. Not just relationship between functions within the individual psyche, but relationship between individuals of different types, and relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, between ego and self, between human and divine. When I recognize that you and I have different types, different dominant functions, different ways of seeing and being, I am called into relationship with otherness. You are not a defective version of me, not someone who needs to be converted to my way of seeing. You are genuinely different, and your difference has value. Your dominant function may be my inferior, or shadow function, the very function I most need to develop, the perspective I most lack. In this sense, typological diversity is not a problem to be overcome, but a gift to be honored. We need each other. The thinking types need the feeling types to remind them of the human dimension, of values that cannot be captured in logic. The feeling types need the thinking types to provide structure, to make difficult decisions, to bring objective analysis to situations where emotion might cloud judgment. The intuitive types need the sensation types to ground their visions in practical reality, to attend to details, to appreciate the concrete present rather than always living in future possibilities. The sensation types need the intuitive types to imagine new possibilities, to see beyond what is to what could be, to bring vision and meaning to practical endeavors. The introverts need the extroverts to bring them into engagement with the outer world, to provide energy and action, to make things happen. The extroverts need the introverts to provide depth and reflection, to process experience internally, to maintain contact with the inner world. This mutual need is the basis for genuine community. Community is not uniformity. It is not everyone being the same type, thinking the same way, valuing the same things. True community is diverse, honoring different gifts, creating space for different ways of being, recognizing that wholeness exists not in any individual, but in the collective, in the balanced interplay of different types and functions. This vision of community has spiritual dimensions. Many spiritual traditions speak of the body of Christ, the Sangha, the Ummah, images of the spiritual community, as an organic whole in which each member has a different role, but all are essential. Typology gives us a psychological language for understanding this organic wholeness. Each type is a different organ in the body, a different note in the symphony, a different color in the palette. And just as the individual's journey toward wholeness requires integrating the shadow, the collective's journey toward wholeness requires integrating the cultural shadow, valuing and developing the functions and attitudes that have been repressed. This is work that requires consciousness, intention, and courage. It requires individuals who are willing to embody the repressed functions, to speak for them, to insist on their value even when the culture resists. In this sense, those who develop their inferior function, who integrate their shadow functions, are not just serving their own individuation, they are serving the collective individuation. They are making consciousness where there was unconsciousness. They are bringing balance where there was one-sidedness. They are contributing to the evolution of the collective psyche. This is the spiritual task that Beebe points to when he speaks of typology as a language for self-understanding and transformation. It is not enough to simply know one's type and live comfortably within it. We are called to grow beyond our type while remaining true to it, to develop what has been undeveloped, to integrate what has been split off, to move toward wholeness. This call comes from what Jung named the self, the center and totality of the psyche that is both our origin and our goal. The self, unlike the ego, is not partial. It does not favor one function over another, one attitude over another. It encompasses all 8 functions, all possible ways of being human. The self is whole, and it calls us toward wholeness. This call manifests in many ways in dreams that show us our shadow, in symptoms that indicate where we are out of balance, in relationships that activate our inferior function, in life crises that force us to develop new capacities. The psyche has a teleology, a purpose, a direction. It seeks not comfort or success in the ego's terms, but meaning, wholeness, the realization of potential. Beebe's model helps us read this teleology, helps us understand what the psyche is calling for. If I am a thinking type experiencing depression, my psyche may be demanding that I develop feeling. If I am a sensation type feeling stuck and bored, my psyche may be calling for the development of intuition. If I am experiencing intense conflicts with a particular person, my psyche may be projecting shadow functions onto them, calling for me to withdraw those projections and own those functions as my own. This reading of symptoms and crises as communications from the self is central to Jungian psychology. Nothing is meaningless. Everything serves the larger purpose of individuation even, and especially what is difficult and painful. The inferior function erupts in embarrassing ways, not to humiliate us, but to get our attention. The shadow manifests in projections, not to create conflict, but to show us what we need to integrate. This teleological understanding is profoundly different from the medical model that dominates mainstream psychology and psychiatry. The medical model sees symptoms as problems to be eliminated, disorders to be cured, dysfunctions to be corrected. The Jungian model sees symptoms as meaningful communications, as expressions of imbalance, as calls toward growth. This does not mean that symptoms should not be alleviated or that suffering should not be reduced, but it means that we attend to the meaning of the symptom, to what it is trying to tell us, to what development or integration it is calling for. Sometimes the symptom cannot be fully resolved until the underlying psychological work is done, until the inferior function is developed, until the shadow is integrated, until the ego learns to relate to the self. This approach requires patience, requires willingness to engage with difficulty rather than simply eliminating it, requires trust that the psyche knows what it is doing, even when the ego is confused or suffering. It is not an easy path, but for those who undertake it, it leads to genuine transformation rather than mere adjustment. Beebe's work in making typology more depth psychological helps facilitate this transformation. It turns type theory from a static classification system into a dynamic map of the individuation process. It shows us not just what we are, but what we might become. It reveals the structure of consciousness and the structure of the unconscious, and it shows how these two structures relate to each other, how they can be brought into dialogue, how they can be integrated into a larger wholeness. In this light, Beebe's restoration of archetypal depth to typology is not just an intellectual achievement, but a spiritual gift. He has given us a language for the soul's journey, a map of the inner world, a way of understanding ourselves that honors both structure and depth, both pattern and particularity, both the universal and the individual. And he has done this not through abstract theorizing, but through grounded clinical work, through careful observation, through the patient listening to what patients and students were teaching him about how the psyche actually operates. His model emerged from experience, from the living encounter between consciousness and the unconscious, from the work of analysis where theory must constantly be tested against reality. This grounding experience is essential. Psychological theories that are too abstract, too removed from lived reality, may be intellectually interesting but are ultimately useless. They do not help people understand themselves. They do not facilitate transformation. They remain academic exercises. Beebe's work avoids this trap. It is sophisticated and nuanced, yes, but it is also practical and applicable. People can take his model and use it to understand themselves, their relationships, their development. Analysts can use it in their clinical work. Teachers can use it to communicate complex psychological ideas. Students can use it to develop psychological vision, to learn to see the archetypal patterns at work in human behavior. This usability is part of Beebe's legacy. He did not just add complexity to type theory for its own sake. He added complexity that illuminates, that helps, that makes typology more useful for the work of individuation. Every addition to the model, the shadow functions, the archetypal assignments, the understanding of projection dynamics serves the practical goal of facilitating self-understanding and growth. As we near the end of our exploration, let us return to where we began, to the image of Beebe as a seeker of shadows, a cartographer of the mind, someone who restored archetypal depth to the world of personality types. What does it mean to restore depth? What had been lost that Beebe recovered? What had been lost in the popularization of typology through the Myers-Briggs and similar instruments was the sense of soul. Personality had become a matter of preferences, of cognitive styles, of categories. It was useful, yes, but it was flat, lacking dimension, lacking mystery. It told you what you were, but not who you were, how you thought, but not what you meant. By bringing back the archetypes, by reconnecting typology to the deeper themes of myth and symbol and transformation, Beebe restored soul to personality theory. He showed that our way of thinking and feeling and perceiving is not just mechanics, but meaning, not just function, but form, not just process, but pattern that connects to the deepest structures of human experience. This restoration matters because we live in an age that tends to reduce everything to surface, to mechanism, to what can be measured and quantified. We have tremendous knowledge about how things work, how neurons fire, how cognition processes information, how genes influence behavior. But we have less wisdom about what things mean, about how to live well, about who we are in our depths. Psychology, if it is to serve human flourishing and not just human adjustment, must address both the how and the why, both the mechanism and the meaning. It must speak to the whole person, body and mind, consciousness and unconscious, ego and self. It must honor both the scientific and the spiritual dimensions of human nature. Beebe's work is part of this larger project of depth psychology, the attempt to understand the psyche in its fullness, to address the questions of meaning and purpose, to facilitate genuine transformation rather than mere symptom reduction. It stands in the lineage of Jung, but it also extends that lineage, adding new dimensions, making connections that Jung himself did not make, bringing depth psychological insights into dialogue with popular typology in ways that make those insights more accessible. In this sense, Beebe is a bridge figure, connecting past and present, theory and practice, elite and popular psychology. He honored the esoteric depths of Jungian thought while making them exoteric, available, applicable. He showed that depth psychology need not be obscure or elitist, that archetypal language can be learned and used by anyone willing to engage seriously with the psyche. This democratization of depth psychology is important. Jung himself was often deliberately obscure, writing in a dense style, using esoteric references, assuming a highly educated audience. This had the effect of keeping his insights within a small circle of initiates. Beebe, like other contemporary Jungians, works to make those insights more widely available without diluting their depth or reducing their complexity. The use of film as teaching tool is part of this democratization. Film is a popular medium, accessible to everyone. By showing how psychological dynamics play out in movies, Beebe makes typology and archetypal psychology come alive in a way that abstract lectures never could. Students see Dorothy and Luke Skywalker and Tony Soprano and recognize themselves, recognize the patterns, recognize the journey. The knowledge becomes embodied, imaginal, memorable. This is teaching in the ancient mode, teaching through story, through image, through myth. It is the way wisdom was transmitted before the age of abstract theory and academic journals. And it may be the way wisdom needs to be transmitted if it is to truly lodge in consciousness, if it is to change how people see and live rather than just adding to their store of information. In contemplating Beebe's legacy, we might ask, what difference does his work make? How is the world different? Because he mapped the 8 function attitudes and their archetypal roles. These are not idle questions. The value of any psychological work ultimately lies in whether it helps people live better, understand more deeply, suffer more consciously, love more fully. Beebe's work makes a difference, I would suggest, in several ways. First, it gives individuals a language for understanding themselves that honors both their gifts and their challenges, both their conscious identity and their shadow. It helps people make sense of their experiences, why some things come easily and others are difficult, why they are attracted to certain people and irritated by others, why certain life transitions are particularly challenging. Second, it facilitates relationship by helping people understand and appreciate typological diversity. When we recognize that others genuinely see and experience the world differently than we do, we become less judgmental, more curious, more able to learn from difference rather than being threatened by it. Third, it provides a framework for psychological work, for the process of individuation. It shows what needs to be developed, what needs to be integrated, where the path of growth lies. It turns the often chaotic and confusing work of self-development into a meaningful journey with markers and milestones. Fourth, it contributes to the larger cultural conversation about what it means to be human, what the psyche is, how consciousness and unconsciousness relate. It keeps alive a vision of the human being that is richer and more mysterious than reductive materialisms would allow, yet remains grounded in careful observation and clinical experience. These contributions may seem modest compared to the grand claims of some psychological theories. Beebe does not promise to cure all ills or to explain everything about human nature. His contribution is more subtle, a map, a language, a way of seeing. But maps and languages and ways of seeing are precisely what we need if we are to navigate the inner world consciously rather than stumbling through it in darkness. In the quiet hours of the night, when the mind drifts and dreams begin to stir, perhaps we carry with us these maps that Beebe has drawn. Perhaps when we dream of the hero facing challenges, or the child playing in dangerous places, or the wise figure offering guidance, we recognize these figures now as aspects of ourselves, as archetypal energies that move through consciousness in their assigned roles. Perhaps when we wake with a feeling we cannot name or a thought that seems foreign to our usual way of thinking, we recognize the touch of an inferior or shadow function, a part of ourselves calling for attention and integration. This is the gift of psychological education, not just information, but transformation of consciousness, not just knowing about, but knowing how to see and be. Beebe's work offers this kind of education. It trains the inner eye, develops psychological vision, makes the invisible visible. As we prepare to end this long meditation on John Beebe and his work, let us rest for a moment in appreciation for those who dedicate their lives to mapping the psyche, to understanding human nature, to facilitating the great work of becoming conscious. This work is not dramatic or heroic in the usual sense. It does not involve conquest or revolution. It involves patient observation, careful thought, humble revision of theories in light of experience, generous sharing of insights through teaching and writing. Yet, this work matters deeply. Every advance in psychological understanding, every new map of the inner world, every articulation of dynamics that were previously unconscious, these serve the larger evolution of human consciousness. They help us become more aware, more integrated, more whole. They reduce the suffering that comes from unconsciousness, from projection, from being at the mercy of autonomous complexes. They increase the possibility of living consciously, deliberately, in alignment with the self. Beebe's particular contribution to this great work was to show that personality itself is mythic, that in the very structure of how we think and feel, there dwell gods and heroes and shadows. That typology can be a path of spiritual development and not just a personality test, that the shadow is not enemy but partner in the journey toward wholeness. He showed that Jung's 8 function attitudes are not just an abstract theoretical construct, but a living reality in the psyche, each function animated by archetypal energy, each playing a role in the drama of personality. He showed that the shadow functions are not simply undeveloped, but are structured according to their own hierarchy, their own archetypal pattern. He showed how projection works at the typological level, how relationships can be understood through the lens of complementary and conflicting functions, how the individuation process requires the gradual integration of all 8 functions into consciousness. These insights did not come from armchair speculation, but from decades of clinical work, from careful observation of how people actually experience their types, from attention to the language people use to describe their psychological processes, from willingness to revise and refine the model as new observations demanded. This is how genuine psychological knowledge develops, not through dogmatic adherence to theory, but through ongoing dialogue between theory and experience, between map and territory, between the general pattern and the particular case. Beebe exemplified this approach, remaining always a student of the psyche, even as he became a teacher to others. In the twilight between waking and sleeping, in that liminal space where consciousness begins to release its grip and the unconscious begins to speak, we might sense the presence of these 8 archetypal figures: the hero striding forth, the parent offering support, the child at play, the anima whispering of mysteries, the opposing personality standing guard, the critical parent passing judgment, the trickster grinning mischievously, the daemon lurking in the deepest shadows. These are not separate beings, but aspects of our own psyche, characters in the ongoing drama of our personality. To know them is to know ourselves more fully. To integrate them is to become more whole. To honor them is to live more consciously, more deliberately, more in alignment with who we truly are and who we might become. This is the path that John Beebe has illuminated, not invented. For the path itself is as old as consciousness, but mapped with new precision, described with new language, made more accessible to those who seek self-understanding. His legacy lives in every analyst who uses his model to understand their patients, in every student who learns to see psychological dynamics through the lens of the 8 function attitudes, in every individual who recognizes in themselves the hero and the shadow, the strength and the vulnerability, the gift and the challenge of their particular type. May we carry forward this work of understanding, of integration, of consciousness. May we honor our own type while developing beyond it. May we appreciate the types of others, recognizing that diversity is not deficiency, but the collective expression of wholeness. May we engage with our shadow functions not as enemies, but as partners, not as weaknesses, but as potential. May we trust the teleology of the psyche, the wisdom of the self, the journey toward individuation even when the path is unclear and the destination unknown. And may we remember, as we drift now toward sleep, that personality is not a cage, but a story being told. Not a limitation, but a perspective on the infinite. Not who we are in totality, but how we are. The particular shape that consciousness takes in its individual manifestation, the unique arrangement of archetypal energies that makes each of us irreplaceable and incomparable. In the deep silence of night, where the borders between self and not-self become permeable, where the unconscious speaks in images and symbols, where the self makes itself known in dreams and intuitions, their Beebe's maps may guide us, helping us recognize the landscape, helping us understand the figures we encounter, helping us remember that we are both the traveler and the journey, both the seeker and what is sought, both the question and, in time, perhaps the answer. Rest now in this knowledge. Let the complexities dissolve into the simplicity of breath and being. Let the 8 functions find their equilibrium in the undifferentiated wholeness of sleep. Let the hero rest from striving, the parent from caretaking, the child from play. Let even the shadow rest, knowing that it too belongs, that it too serves, that it too is welcomed in the larger economy of the soul. John Beebe has done his work, mapping the territory, teaching the language, illuminating the path. Now it is our work to travel that path, to learn that language, to explore that territory. Each of us must undertake the journey for ourselves, must confront our own shadow, must integrate our own inferior function, must move toward our own wholeness. But we do not travel alone. We travel in the company of all those who have gone before, who have wrestled with the same challenges, who have mapped the same territory. We travel with the archetypes themselves as guides and companions, the hero who gives us courage, the parent who provides support, the child who brings spontaneity, the anima who connects us to depth, even the shadow figures who challenge and transform us. And we travel toward the self, that center and totality that is both origin and goal, both who we always were and who we are becoming, both the ground of our being and the horizon of our possibility. In this journey, typology is a lantern in the darkness, a compass in confusion, a map when we are lost. It does not determine our destination, but helps us navigate toward it. It does not define who we must be, but clarifies who we are and might become. It does not solve the mystery of existence, but gives us language to articulate it, tools to explore it, companions to share it. For this gift, for the restoration of depth to the map of personality, for the integration of typology and archetype, for the bridge between popular and depth psychology, For the illumination of shadow and the path toward wholeness, we can be grateful to John Beebe. His contribution endures not in statues or monuments, but in the transformed consciousness of those who have learned from him, in the individuals who have used his maps to find their way, in the quiet work of integration and individuation that continues in consulting rooms and in the privacy of individual souls. Let that work continue. Let consciousness grow. Let shadows be integrated. Let wholeness be approached step by patient step, function by gradually developed function, archetype by acknowledged archetype. Let the drama of personality unfold, not unconsciously and compulsively, but consciously and deliberately, as a story told with awareness, as a myth lived with intention, as a journey undertaken with courage and curiosity and compassion. And let us sleep. Now, wanderers of consciousness, with gratitude for those who have lit the path, with wonder at the complexity and beauty of the psyche, with trust in the journey toward wholeness that continues even in dreams, even in darkness, even in the silent hours when the conscious mind rests and the deeper self works its mysterious transformation. Good night, seekers of shadow and light. May your dreams be generous teachers. May your typological pattern reveal itself in all its richness. May your hero and your shadow dance together toward integration. May you wake more conscious than you slept, more whole than you were, more yourself than ever before. The story of John Beebe is told. The maps are drawn. The path is illuminated. Now the work is yours, and mine, and ours together. The eternal work of becoming conscious, of integrating shadow, of honoring diversity, of moving toward wholeness. May we carry it forward with dedication and humility, with courage and compassion, with wonder and wisdom. Rest now. Dream well. The journey continues in morning light and in the darkness of night, in the clear consciousness of day and in the symbolic wisdom of dreams. All of it matters. All of it serves. All of it leads toward the wholeness that is both our nature and our calling, both what we are and what we are becoming, both the ground beneath our feet and the star toward which we journey. Peace to all functions. Peace to all archetypes. Peace to the ego and to the shadow. Peace to the conscious and the unconscious. Peace to the self, that is, and peace to the self that calls us ever onward, ever inward, ever toward integration and wholeness that is the birthright and the task of every human soul.